Hey Joy family, happy Thursday. It's great to come to you again today. And before we get into God's Word and finding some encouragement there, I want to tell you about a couple things that are upcoming. First of all, tonight our Ladies Connection is meeting. Just a time for our ladies to get together for encouragement, for prayer, and just to see each other again, connect with each other. They're going to be down the hill from the church, down at the Dell in the park at 7 o'clock tonight. So why don't you join them? All ladies are invited to that, and it's just going to be a great time. And then this Sunday, we are continuing our time of worship together, both in person and through our live stream. So if you want to come in person, please go to our website, look at some of our guidelines that we have listed there just for health and safety of everyone. But we also be live streaming our service again at 10 o'clock. So you can join us either way. We'd love you to join us. We're going to be in Romans chapter 13, finishing that up as we're finishing up this amazing letter of Paul to the Romans. And it's just been a great journey. So you can join us for that. And so we have that coming up. Then next Wednesday, the youth group's having a barbecue over at Pastor Anthony's house. So you can also make use of that. We'll have information about that on our Facebook page and on our website, where you can learn more about that evening. But today, without further ado, we're going to continue looking at some of these miracles of Jesus. We've been looking at some of my favorite. We're not going to look at all the miracles of Jesus, but some of my favorite miracles of Jesus, some that really stand out to me. If you remember, the miracles of Jesus are so much more than just demonstrations of his power. It's actually revelation of who he is, and he's doing it through these supernatural acts. And we can learn a lot about ourselves and about Jesus through these miracles. And we've been in Mark for the last couple, and we're going to continue in Mark chapter 5, where we have two miracles that are kind of sandwiched together, and we're going to look at one today and then one on Tuesday. So in Mark chapter 5, if you remember, Jesus just cast out these demons, these unclean spirits from a man over the north side of the Sea of Galilee. And He had done that with that man. It was an amazing miracle how he did that. And the demons recognized who Jesus was and make this revelation of who he is. And now the disciples and Jesus go back in their boats, get back in their boats and go south again, back to Capernaum to across the Sea of Galilee. And when they get there, large crowds are there to meet him. And they're crowding in on him. And one of the rulers of the synagogue, a guy named Jairus, comes running up to Jesus and falls at his feet and says, "Jesus, my daughter is dying. In fact, she's at the point of death. You need to come because perhaps you can heal her and make her well." So Jesus goes with Jairus, and this huge crowd follows Jesus as they're walking to Jairus. And there's an incident. And here's the incident. There's a woman who's in this crowd, or who joins the crowd, and it says she has an issue of blood. Basically, for over 12 years, she's had this issue with bleeding, this either menstrual bleeding or something like that she's having. She's been to doctors to try to fix this, to find health again, and nothing has worked, and she's exhausted all of her money, all of her options. And this is a big deal, not just because health-wise it's making her feel horrible and it's dangerous, and and how awful that is, but in the Jewish faith, this made her unclean. Back in the law of Moses, you had the laws were given, and one of the things was when a woman's having her natural cycle, her monthly cycle, and she's bleeding, during that time she is unclean. No one can touch her. She can't touch anybody, and they're considered unclean. Now, this woman is having it constantly, which is making her almost an outcast from society and making her unclean in society, in her community. So she is just at her wit's end, and she's probably just so discouraged and so downtrodden. And she hears Jesus is there, and she says, "Maybe if I can just touch the cloth on his garment, I'll find healing." And this is kind of showing her desperation. If I can just do this, but I don't want anybody else to know about this. So this is kind of what we have. So she had heard reports. So here's what she says, here's what happens in Mark chapter 5. It says in verse 28, "For she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up. So she goes up to Jesus, and in this huge crowd of people, she touches his garment, his robe or whatever. And it says, immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Isn't that cool? Just the touch of his garment, of Jesus' garment. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth, or what she did. And Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Now, this is just an amazing scene, if you can kind of picture this. So you have this huge crowd, and you have this woman, and she's probably hunched over and feeling horrible, but also not wanting anybody to see her or know that she's touched them, because the people in the community would know that she's unclean as well. And she comes up to Jesus and just reaches out and touches his garment. As soon as she does that, she feels the flow of blood dries up, and she feels within herself, "I'm healed." And at the same moment of this, Jesus turns around and says, "Who touched me?" Jesus knowing that somebody touched him. Okay? This isn't Jesus being surprised by this and not wanting power, not knowing power went out from him. He knew power went out from him. He knew that this woman was healed. He's doing this as a display, publicly display what had happened. So he goes around and he says, "Who touched me?" And obviously his disciples, being helpful as they always usually are, they're saying, "What do you mean, who touched you? Everybody's touching you. Everybody's closing in on you. You're like in a crowd kind of walking through it." And Jesus is saying, "Who touched me?" "Everybody touched you, Jesus." And Jesus is like, No. Somebody touched me. Who was it? And the whole crowd's like, what is he talking about? But this woman knew. She knew it was her, but she's like, "Oh no, I've been found out. I wanted to do this quietly because I don't want anybody to know, because I'm unclean, and I just am so ashamed of myself, of who I am and who I've become. So I don't want anybody to know." But then once she knows she's outed, it says she came in fear and trembling to Jesus. She throws herself at his feet, and it says, tells him the whole truth. "Jesus, I have this issue, and I knew that only you could heal me. I mean, you're my last hope, and I knew if I could just touch your garment, I would be healed." And Jesus says to her, I can picture him looking at her and saying, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." And then he says, "Go in peace and be healed of your disease." This is an amazing scene, right? But really what Jesus is revealing in this, Jesus is bigger than the physical world, than nature. He's physical. He's greater than the spiritual world. Now he's greater than health, than our diseases, right? He's showing in this miracle. But even more than this, what he's revealing to himself is Jesus came not only to heal our diseases, but to heal our shame. This woman lived a life of shame. She lived a life alone, that she feels that nobody knows her pain, nobody accepts her, nobody would ever want to be around her. And Jesus changes that in an instant. I mean, look at this. She has this issue of blood, right? She's unclean. Everybody sees her as unclean. And she comes in secret to him. She comes saying, "I don't know if I can do this." Have you ever felt like that? Have you ever been in shame? And you don't want anybody to know, do you? You don't want anybody to know what you're doing or where you're going and things like this and what you're struggling with. And she's kind of coming that same way in shame and just saying, if I can just touch his garment, at least that would improve some of my life. And when she touches it, everything changes. And it's interesting in touching the garment of Christ, the robe of Christ, because this is what Jesus does for us. Jesus does this for us in taking away our sin, doesn't he? He changes us from being unclean to being clean, to being spotless, acceptable to God. And he does that in an instant. And what Romans talks a little bit about is gives this picture that Christ robes us in his righteousness, right? He clothes us in righteousness, or he puts on to us his robe. And when we wear that, we are clean. We wear that righteousness. So here, her touching the robe of Christ, and her shame is taken away. It's huge, isn't it? And when she does that, and when she knows that she's healed, and then Jesus turns to her and she runs to him and lays at his feet and just say, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And how does Jesus respond? He comes back at her and says, daughter. Now imagine this. He's not saying woman. He's not saying, hey, you, or anything like that, or whatever your name is. But he draws her close, right? He gives her this intimate greeting. Daughter, you're in the family. It's almost like he's saying to her, you're now included. Okay, once you were an outcast, now you're included. You're a daughter. And that was for her, right? He's basically saying, you're accepted. You're now accepted. Your shame is gone. So he does that part for her. But then the next part he does for the crowd, because he says, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be healed, right? And he's doing this publicly. See, this woman never wanted anything to be public here. She didn't want to be singled out. All she wanted to do was be healed. But now Jesus goes beyond just healing her. And he says, your shame is taken away. And then it's almost as if by doing this, be healed, doing it publicly, he's saying to the crowd, this woman who you once looked at with shame or as shame is now clean. Accept her again. She is now clean. So in doing that, he's not only, telling her, but he's broadcasting it to everyone else. And saying, yes, this person is now clean. Isn't this an incredible miracle? Because this is what Jesus does for us. This is what he came to do for us on the cross, where he dies for us and he takes our sin and he rises from the dead, right? To defeat death and also to defeat sin and shame for us. And when we can reach out to him and we can grasp hold of him, we find healing. Not only healing from our main problem, which is sin, right? The life and death issue, but in taking away our sin, he also takes away our shame. We no longer have to walk in that and saying, oh, I'm just a mess up. Oh, I'm a horrible person. Look at what I've done again. Now we're robed in Christ. We're a child of his. And we can now say with confidence, I am clean. I am clean. So that is this miracle of this woman with the issue of blood. Jesus heals our shame. Hey, have a great rest of the week. Be encouraged today that Jesus is the only one who can heal us and who can take away our sin and shame. Have a great day, Joy.